Jim Himes of Connecticut. He's the ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee. Congressman, thank you for being with us this morning on a very busy news day. Let's start with what we're seeing in the Middle East. Strikes last night, continuing today, and coming after days, really weeks, of President Trump saying to Israel, this isn't what I want. Let's try to settle this at the negotiating table. But Prime Minister Netanyahu went ahead.
Yeah, and not at all surprising to me, right? And I mean, it's important to put this in context, like decades worth of context. You know, Iran has been a massive destabilizing force for a very long time, and we all agree that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Israel is our ally. We will stand by Israel. But there are some undercurrents here that we can't ignore. You know, just to give you a couple, number one, I think it's sort of unanimous that war is the last resort for reasons practical and ethical. And in this instance, war is not the last resort. In fact, war was undertaken at a time when President Trump and his people were trying to reach a diplomatic agreement. Of course, there's a context to that, too, right? Because in 2018, the president tore up a diplomatic agreement that had done a pretty good job of keeping Iran in a box. Secondly, look, the prime minister is making a bet here, and I think based on my contact with him, this extends well beyond taking out nuclear infrastructure and trying to effect and maybe hoping for a regime change. Here's the other underlying factor. Anyone who's watched the Middle East since World War II knows that you can go into the Middle East with the best of hopes and expectations only to have it crash around your ears. So there is a huge, and I think the stock market that you just pointed out reflects this, there is a huge range of possibilities here, a lot of them very, very ugly, and not just for the region, but for gasoline prices at the pump, for the possibility that American troops get sucked in. So anyway, this is a moment of real nervousness for a lot of people, I think.
And certainly a lot of Iran's proxies have really been damaged since October 7th and the fallout. So that might have been part of the factors here that convinced Israel now's the time to do this. I mean, what do you hope comes next here? A return to the negotiating table? Like, if, you know, what are, you said it, there are larger concerns here. I mean, American troops on the ground is something that President Trump, of course, has said he will not do. Sometimes events get away from you.
Yeah, look, in my opinion, this notion that there will be a return to the negotiating table is insane. I mean, the Iranians are the inheritors of a 2,000-year, very proud history, going back to the Persians, you know, who were fighting with the Athenians. The Iranians, in my opinion, are not going to the negotiating table. They cannot, the regime cannot be perceived as having been forced to the negotiating table. So they're in this, and we need to pray that the outperformance, the surprising outperformance of the Israelis, both against Hezbollah and against Hamas, continues. Look, we all know what the best outcome here is. The best outcome is that the nuclear infrastructure is taken out, that the regime falls, and somehow the Iranian people put in place a democratic regime. But again, you can't name for me an example in the last 50 years where, you know, military activity in the Middle East has ended well and predictably.
Congressman John Heilman has the next question.
Hey, Congressman, we've been focused a lot on what's going on in Los Angeles over the course of this week. But back in Washington, the Secretary of Defense has been on Capitol Hill and kind of refusing, in a number of cases, refusing to answer questions that seem pretty straightforward and pretty legitimate, like talking about what the plans are and the budget's going to be for this retrofitting of the new Qatari Air Force One. Yesterday, he refused to answer a question from one of your colleagues, Ro Khanna, about whether he would abide by federal court rulings that were laid down. I'm curious about what you think of how you evaluate on the whole here, also his willingness immediately to dispatch those 700 Marines to L.A. I'm curious what you think of how Secretary Hegseth is doing at this point, and whether we're starting to see some of the things that people worried about with his confirmation.
Well, of course we are, right? I mean, look, we could have a partisan bickering match about this, but serious people know that Pete Hegseth is way, way out of his depth, right? We saw this with the Signal chat. We saw it. We see it over and over and over again. And at the time of the Signal chat scandal, for example, when he was posting, you know, in advance of strikes, precisely the weapon systems being used to undertake strikes against the Houthi, what I thought to myself, well, let's just hope that we don't have an international conflict that actually requires Pete Hegseth to provide advice, to provide wisdom, to provide judgment. And here we are with a war ongoing in the Middle East. So his behavior is perfectly predictable, right? If you work for Donald Trump, you are not a cabinet secretary, you are an acolyte. And you do exactly what Donald Trump wants you to do. And Donald Trump wants that Qatari jet. He wants the option to deploy the Marines throughout the United States. If you read that order that he issued, he can deploy military force, not just in Los Angeles. And it is not going to be Pete Hegseth who says, yeah, I'm not quite sure I agree with the president on that point. So not at all surprising that he couldn't even say, you didn't mention, but he couldn't even tell Mike Turner, my former chairman of the intelligence, he couldn't even tell Mike Turner that the Pentagon didn't have plans to attack Greenland because, of course, he can't.
Yeah, and certainly there have been a lot of questions raised about that, Greenland and Panama, from that hearing the other day. Ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee, Democratic Congressman Jim Himes of Connecticut, thank you. We always appreciate you coming in.